Awesome. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone who stuck around today. I know day 2 of a conference, especially on a Sunday, can be really tough. I know I personally have the attention span of a toddler at this point, so thank you for sticking around and focusing. So I wanted to talk about internationalization today. My name is Robin, and I work for a company called Taulia in Austin, Texas. And at Taulia, we support 18 different locales in our application. So I've been learning along the way what it means to truly internationalize an app. And I learned a lot of things that I didn't know, and that I wanted to share with you all today. So I chose this topic not necessarily because I'm an internationalization expert, but because of the experience I had living in China and Taiwan. So prior to living in Austin, I lived in China and Taiwan, and I experienced a lot of frustrating and confusing UIs because those websites were built for people in China, not for American English speakers like myself. So I have a lot of empathy for those in the US who maybe aren't native English speakers who are experiencing these frustrating and confusing UIs. And I wanted to come here to encourage you all to take the steps necessary to internationalize your applications. So today I wanted to cover the following. So first of all, what is internationalization? How is it different from localization and globalization? And why is it important? Because there might be a lot of you here today who have an app that is local to the US or maybe just specific to your city, and I want to explain why it's still important for you to internationalize even if you know you're only going to support English. Then I'm going to show you how to set up a translation file using an internationalization framework called React.js. And then finally, we're going to go beyond translations and talk about what it means to internationalize beyond just being able to change the language. And this is kind of the section that I talked about of things I didn't know that I didn't know. So there's a lot of little things that will come across when you're internationalizing. So what is internationalization? First of all, just an FYI, if you ever see in my presentation or while you're researching online the shortened version of I-18N, that is just a numeronym. It just means that there's 18 letters between I and N in the same way that accessibility is shortened to A11Y or ally. Just an FYI. So we've got 3 terms here. So we have internationalization, localization, and globalization. And I used to use these interchangeably, which is incorrect. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page of what they actually mean. So internationalization is what we generally do first. And us as developers, this is usually where the bulk of our work is coming in, not on the localization side. So internationalization, hopefully we are able to do this first, and we do such a good job that we just do this once. And then later on, perhaps in 2 years, your PM comes to you and says, hey, we want to localize in Spanish. And then you could add that language in, and then 2 years later, you decide to add German language. And so you're localizing multiple times, but internationalization is usually something we do once. And so that's the act of going through the app and looking at certain components. So perhaps you have a date formatted in there, and a properly internationalized application would take that date, and you could pass it in an American format or a British format, and it would reflect properly depending on which region you're in. It's not hard-coded. So the act of internationalization is where we as developers are spending most of our time. Another visualization is the following. So localization is just kind of what you're seeing on the surface, and internationalization is everything that goes on under the scenes. And globalization is all of this together. It's a blanket term for localization and internationalization together. I use the word locale, and I just wanted to make sure we all know what I mean by that. So we generally don't always want to just translate to an entire language. We know that in the US, American English is different from British English, and the same is true in lots of languages. So Spanish from Spain is different from Spanish in Mexico, and so sometimes we want to make certain that we're showing the language from a certain region, and we can show that with things called BCP47 language tags. And any internationalization library or datetime library is going to expect you to format it in this way. And so you can specify the region, and with the case of Chinese, you can specify, is it going to be simplified characters or traditional characters? So now that you know the what is internationalization, I wanted to talk about the why. So I've got two graphs here, and I know the words are kind of hard to read, but basically if you look on the left, that big bar there is English. So this is languages found on the web. You go onto a website, there's a drop-down, you can select which language. This tells you that over 50% of the web is available in English. So we're quite lucky and fortunate that we speak English because most of the web is translated for us. But if you look at the graph on the right, internet users by language, English speakers actually only make up about 25% of the internet users, and as more and more people are getting online, that number is only going to shrink. So that's a percentage. That percentage will shrink because most of the people who aren't online right now and are getting online generally aren't English speakers. So there's this huge discrepancy in terms of what's available on the internet in certain languages and what need there is out there. So from a financial standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, it makes sense to be able to offer different languages to these people that don't have the apps that they want to access because it's just not available to them. And this is global, but the same thing is true here in the US. So we have 64 million people, or 21%, who speak a language other than English. And we have 25 million people, or 8.5%, who speak English less than very well. So even if your app is just an American app that's only going to be used in the US, if you're only supporting English and you're not supporting Spanish or other languages, you're missing out on 25 million potential customers. Beyond like a financial standpoint or a marketing standpoint, I think internationalization is super important because it is a part of accessibility. So we often think of accessibility as helping people with visual impairments or physical disabilities, but it's also our duty to make sure that the web is accessible to non-English speakers as well. I believe that the internet is a human right, and we shouldn't deny it to those people just because they weren't fortunate enough to learn English wherever they are located. So you might be thinking, okay, I'm totally down to internationalize, so all I need to do is Google Translate, right? And the answer is absolutely not. I can tell you from experience when I lived in China and Taiwan that Google Translate's not going to cut it. So often I would run across super inappropriate translations or unprofessional translations. And if you throw in Google Translate, you're gonna end up with something like this, like use the queen to invite powerful water. It's just, it's not gonna make sense. Your customers are gonna be confused. You might accidentally offend somebody if you have a really weird translation. So you really wanna make sure that you're actually using real translations, not just Google Translate. Okay, so let's imagine that we've decided that we are going to support multiple locales and we want to set up an app from scratch. I'm going to show you how to set up a super simple app in English and in Spanish. So at our company, we use React.js. React.js is a part of a larger ecosystem, i18next, so it's just a JavaScript library. So they've got an Angular version, a Vue version, Ember version, backend versions like Node and PHP. So it's an internationalization framework, and when you're looking at different internationalization frameworks, there are certain things that you want to look for that React.js provides for you, but most internationalization frameworks are going to provide those for you. So for example, plurals. And what I mean by that is in English, if we have 0 of something, we don't have an S. Or we do have an S. If we have 1 of something, we don't have an S. If we have 2 or more, we have an S. So 0 cats, 1 cat, 2 cats. And that makes sense in English and in Spanish, but in French, the 0 is different. And in Chinese, there are no plurals and singulars. And in Czech, there are 3 or more plurals. And so figuring out like which language needs what is really confusing. So you want a library that you can just pass in a number and the noun, and it will figure it out for you. Another thing is interpolation. Sometimes you're just going to have static text that needs to be translated, but oftentimes you're going to want to pass in some dynamic content, perhaps a link, something like that. I also like that that ij8next provides a plugin to detect the user language. So you never want to force a language on a user. You always want to let them choose. When I lived in China, I didn't want to see websites in Chinese, even though I was in China. So you want the user to select that language. However, the first time that they come on your website, maybe you want to just detect the browser language and then let them choose from there. And it also helps you to load and cache the translations. which is really helpful, especially if your app is really large and you've got an API that are pulling in tons and tons of translations. It's also pretty flexible and scalable, so it worked for smaller applications and larger applications. Okay, so I'm going to show you just how to make a hello world and translate it. So this is pretty simple. I only have 2 translations. So I have hello world in English and then hola mundo in Spanish. And because it's quite small, I'm just going to put it in a static JSON file and bundle that with my application. Again, obviously, as your app grows, you probably don't want to do this, but for the sake of this demo, it's totally fine. I've called this greeting. You can call it whatever you want, but I'm just going to access it using that word greeting. And so how I initialize this, somewhere in my app, maybe you want to make a file called i18next.js or directly put this in your index.js file. You want to import 2 different libraries, i18next and React.js. And then you pull in your translations from somewhere. Again, we've just had that static JSON file. And then you just pass in your translations into this i18next object. You initialize it saying, hey, we're going to use the React i18next version of this. And then I've just set the language to default to English. That's that LNGEN. You can also configure it more, like maybe you want a fallback language if English isn't available, etc. Okay, and then once that's set up, now all of our components have access to these translations. We just need to pull in from that library. So what I do, if I'm still using a class, I would import this thing called with translation from React i18next, and then I wrap my component with this with translation higher order component. So once I've done that, now I have access to i18next props, and I can pull in this t function, this const t equals this.props. So t is just the function that you're going to use to translate. This is pretty common with most internationalization frameworks. They're going to call it t. And then remember, in that JSON file, I have called my English version and my Spanish version greeting. So I just pass in the path to that. So t greeting, and then what that will spit out is my hello world. If I'm using a functional component, it's even easier because you don't have to use the higher order component. You can just pull in this use translation hook. Super simple. You just pull in const t equals use translation, and you're ready to go. And again, this is going to show hello world. But say hello world isn't cutting it anymore, and I want to make this a little bit more dynamic. Now I want to say hello and then to my user's name, and I want to pass in something. I'm going to call this variable name. And then inside of my function, I'm going to pass in name Robin, this object, into that greeting. And now this is going to say hello Robin instead of hello world. And there are other things you can pull in from this use translation hook, or if you're using the HOC, I can pull in the i18n object itself. And so if I wanted to change languages when you click on a button, all I have to do is pull in that i18n object, call i18n.changeLanguage, and then pass in that locale tag. And now when I click on that, it's going to say hola Robin. So super simple to set that all up. But I want to go beyond just translations because, as I mentioned earlier, you can still have an internationalized app that is only English. And so I wanted to make sure that I address what I mean by that and the type of things that you want to look out for. So probably the most common thing outside of translations that people think about when they're internationalizing are things like dates, times, time zones, calendars, numbers. So these can be super confusing. And what I mean by that, okay, so if I've got this date here, 01/02/2019, and I ask a group of Americans, what is this date? They will probably answer back that this is January 2nd. If I go across the ocean and ask a group of people from the UK the same date, they will say this is February 1st. So here's your first glaringly obvious issue. Yes, your app is only in English, but you still need to internationalize because a British user who sees that date is going to get very confused. Another thing in the US, we generally prefer 12-hour clocks, so with the AM and the PM, but in places like Germany, they prefer the 24-hour style clock. Time zones. I'm guessing you're all laughing because you know what it's like working with time zones. It's super, super confusing and super frustrating. So time zones can be on the half-hour mark, on the 15-minute mark. Some time zones observe daylight savings time, some don't. Sometimes within your own country, like the US, Parts of the country observe it and parts don't. And the ones that do observe it, they observe it on different times. There's leap years. It's just really confusing. It's really hard to deal with. Another problem, so in the US, we generally like to start our calendars on a Sunday. In the UK, they like to start their calendars on a Monday. If I show a group of Americans this number, so 1234566.78, and I ask them to format it, they would probably format it like so, 123, 456, decimal point 78. If I show that same number to a group of people from India, they would probably format it like this, 1, 23, 456, decimal point 78. And to make it even crazier, if I go to Europe and I ask them how to format it, they swap the comma and the decimal point from what Americans do, so 123, decimal point 456, 78. And this is just 3 ways to format numbers. There's so many more. Percentages can be different. So in the US, we do 5%. In Turkey, they swap that. In countries like Spain, they might put a space in between the number and the percentage. Currencies can be tricky. If you have a country that uses dollars, you want to make sure that you know they're talking about US dollars or Canadian dollars or Australian dollars. You want to make sure that that currency makes sense to that user based on the region. So I've given you a bunch of problems, but what is the solution to this problem? Basically, don't try to solve it yourself. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of open source libraries to choose from, so specifically for dates and times, there's things like Moment.js or DateFNS. I know a lot of people really don't like Moment.js because it's a bloated package, so actually while I was looking for different libraries out there, I found this GitHub repo called You Don't Need Moment.js. So if you want to compare and contrast and pick something else besides Moment.js, there's lots of options for you out there. Just be careful that not all of these do support time zones, so if that's something important to your application, make sure you choose the correct library. Another thing that's out there is a JavaScript native API called Intl, INTL. And this is something you can just open up your dev tools right now and play with Intl, and it's pretty cool. It's got a lot of things just right out of the box. So it has things like relative time format, it has list format, number format, plurals. So here's a couple examples of something that you could achieve with Intl. You could pass in ESMX or Spanish from Mexico and say, like, I want it to return what is -1 month, and it returns hace un mes. You can tell it that you want to format a number and then give it the Japanese currency, so the JA stands for Japanese, and then it will format it with the yen symbol in front. Some final tips for dealing with dates and times are the following. Keep consistent and keep your communication open. If you have one team creating the API and one team creating something that consumes the API, make sure you know what's being returned. What I really like to do is to store your dates in UTC, which is Coordinated Universal Time. It's not a time zone, it's just the standard that we've decided that this is what 0 is. And then you can format it on the front end with your library of choice. And then also store your numbers as integers. Again, just let all the formatting happen on the front end. And then if this all doesn't work, you can just invite Ryan Gosling over to your office and have him go, hey girl, did you lose a timestamp? Because I'm pretty sure it's datetime.now. I know those are really old, but I just really wanted to include that. And this is not really a solution per se, but I was just kind of curious, like, where is all this data coming from? Like, how do they know when these time zones are happening? Like, who is keeping track of that? So the answer is the CLDR, the Common Locale Data Repository, which is put on by the Unicode Consortium. It includes things like language names, so like what is French in French, country and territory names, currency names, time zones, calendar fields, number patterns, and a lot more. So this is not something you're going to probably directly interact with. This is probably something as a dependency for another library that you interact with directly. It's just kind of an FYI. All right, so the next problem that you're going to run into are things like non-Latin characters. And what I mean by a Latin character is just like A through Z. So if you've ever seen any characters like this with like the boxes or the question marks or something like this, that happened because something wasn't properly encoded for a non-Latin character, most likely. again, hitting home the point that like, even if you're in the US and you are only using English, you still need to worry about internationalization problems, because in the US, there are people who don't have, like all the letters in their name might not be just A through Z. So Zoe here has an umlaut, the little 2 dots over her E, and someone has written a regex expression to tell her that her name is invalid. And that's not a good experience for Zoe. Like, you don't want to tell someone that their name is invalid. So what is the solution for all of this? Make sure you're properly encoding things. You can set this a variety of ways, but one way is setting this in your header with the meta charset equals UTF-8. You could also set this in your HTTP headers. Use Unicode when you can. So Unicode is great because not only does it support just A through Z, but it also has Japanese characters, Chinese characters, emoji, it's got everything. If you do decide that you are going to accept non-Latin characters, be aware when you're sorting. You can't just sort A through Z, so just be conscious of that. And be aware what your regex is checking for. So here's the example from the slide before. We don't want to tell someone that their name is invalid, especially if you can store this name in your database. Like, make sure your regex matches up with how you're storing things. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is more of a UX issue than a development issue, but it's still important that we think about this. So oftentimes we design with only English speakers in mind. So say perhaps someone says, let's make a button for saving, and you measure out how long save is, and you store this as a fixed width. And you probably know where I'm going with this. Once your PM asks you to support another language, suddenly you get something like this, where the Spanish word is much longer and the text is dangling off. This is going to happen to you all the time. So here's an example. I've got the word views. In English, that's only 5 letters. So say somewhere on my website, I want to count like 100 views, 200 views, etc. And I want to translate this into multiple languages. That's going to work fine in Korean and Chinese, where the ratio is pretty similar to English, but it's not going to work in Portuguese, French, and German. And for some reason, it's always German. German is just like super long words. It's actually what I use when I'm like actually like manually testing to make sure things fit. German's just super long. So the solution to this is just, have a talk with your UX designer and make sure that they know that they're aware that they need to allow enough flexibility and space that translated text fits into your design. I found this rule of thumb online. I thought it was pretty good. If your English is fewer than 10 characters, make sure that you leave enough room for 3 times the expansion. And if it's greater than 10 characters, if you have a long block of text, leave room for 30% expansion. And then for us as developers, when you're coding this out in CSS, don't use fixed widths. Keep your CSS flexible so it can grow and shrink so it's going to fit in all languages. The next thing that you might come across is supporting a right-to-left language, and this is probably just a small percentage of you, so I'm going to keep this section short. There's a lot I could talk about with right-to-left languages. All the examples so far have been left-to-right languages, but right-to-left languages, for example, are Arabic or Hebrew. So if I've got a left-to-right language website here, Wikipedia, I've got the Wikipedia logo on the left, and then I've got like buttons on the right that say like create account login, and all the text runs from left to right. If I have the same page in a right to left language like Arabic, everything's swapped. So you can see the Wikipedia logo is jumping from one side to the other. The buttons are jumping from one side to the other. Your icons will be, they'll be flipped like a mirror image, and all the text goes in a different direction. So how you can get your text to do this is by adding dir, D-I-R, equals RTL to your HTML. But when you do this, you're going to run into troubles because what's left is now right, and what's right is now left, and it can be really tricky. So if you're using things like float left, it will stay left in both left to right and right to left. And I know that's tricky to like think about which is left and which is right, but if you use something like flexbox, which has flex start and flex end, that will observe the correct directionality of your language. And that just kind of brings up a good point that we should be naming things based on what they do, not what they look like. So an example I have, so let's say we have pagination arrows. So I've got a left arrow and a right arrow. I shouldn't be calling that left arrow and right arrow. I should be calling that previous and next, because if that happens to be swapped in a right to left language, it still makes sense to call it previous and next, but calling it left and right can be really tricky. So we can use vocabulary like before, start, beginning, backwards, above. Those all make sense in both left to right and right to left languages. Then I had some final things that I wanted to mention that didn't really fit under any of those 4 categories. Make sure you're always adding a language tag to your HTML. So this is important for a variety of reasons like SEO, but also for screen readers. If you wanted to dynamically update it, you can use something like React Helmet. Be careful with your routing. So if you dynamically name your route, so say you call this based on what a component is named, that works in English and Spanish and German, but like once you have a Chinese, once your route has some Chinese in it, that won't work. You can't have Chinese characters in your URL, so just be careful with your routing. Be careful with your fonts. So English, French, Spanish probably will be okay, but once you get into like Korean, Thai, Arabic, that font might not look good. You might have to pull in multiple fonts or change your font. One character can have meaning in some languages. So in China, many people just have one character for their last name, and you don't want to have some sort of regex that's telling them that their last name is too short, because that is their last name. They can't make it longer. Don't concatenate your strings. So this is more for translations. Don't assume that how English grammatical structure is similar in other languages. So if something is at the beginning of a sentence in English, it doesn't mean that it will be at the beginning in other languages. So don't concatenate those strings. It won't work in other languages. So here's some final takeaways. Try to design your app to be language, region, and culture independent. Use open source projects to help you solve problems that you didn't even know existed. And then keep in mind that globalizing can mean bigger markets, more inclusiveness, and just better code that is extendable and easier to manage. So the too long didn't listen, just try to be like Pitbull, Mr. Worldwide. And that's all I have. Thank you.